This article first appeared on the History News Network. For too long, progressive intellectuals have mocked conservatives as know-nothings for their insistence that the U.S. is immune to history and can't be compared to other countries because it is simply superior. I suspect, however, that historians, even radical ones, suffer just as much from American exceptionalism. Keep up with this story and more by subscribing now. Our version of this mindset is evoked by the title of Sinclair Lewis's 1935 novel, It Can't Happen Here. No military coups, no dictatorships, no violent revolutions, no breaks in the constitutional order. What do we really have to worry about? The United States will persevere somehow, and if you need reassurance, recall Watergate's bipartisan removal of a president via constitutional processes. And then along came Trump, a variant of the Star and Stripes used by a neo-Nazi party headquartered in Westland, Michigan, the 13th of August 2015. Public domain. It's pretty obvious that the certainty "it could never happen here" was foolish in hindsight. More than just admitting error, we need to face up to what history tells us is possible. It is thoroughly exceptionalist to treat Trumpism as a temporary aberration, brought on by the peculiarities of the Electoral College and the Republican Party's takeover by the organized right. There is no fundamental reason to insist the U.S. is immune from authoritarian government, whether outright fascism or a regime maintaining the technical forms of democracy, a legislature, formal elections, courts that issue sentences, while actively subverting democracy's real content. Turkey and much of Central and Eastern Europe, including Czechia, Hungary, and Poland, are trending towards authoritarian democracy, an oxymoron if there ever was one, and Putin's Russia shows them how to do it. We have to stop treating the deep anti-democratic currents in modern U.S. history as exceptions, mistakes that will never happen again. We should know better. In the past century, there are any number of existing legislative and judicial precedents for large-scale repression and direct attacks on democratic rights, none formally overturned by Supreme Court action. A constitutional amendment. The Espionage Act of 1918 criminalized peaceful dissent in wartime. Approximately 2,000 people were jailed for speaking or writing against U.S. entry into World War I, often for long sentences. Wartime repression functioned at many levels. Local authorities encouraged mob violence against radicals, leading to lynchings and an epidemic of flogging. In 1919, Attorney General Mitchell A. Palmer authorized raids to round up 10,000 immigrants without habeas corpus protections, and 500 were shipped to the Soviet Union. That first Red Scare was powered by the new Bureau of Investigation led by the young J. Edgar Hoover. Over the next half-century, his FBI centered an anti-subversive network inside and outside government which engaged in covert attacks on anyone Hoover considered un-American. World War II was worse. In February 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the Army to deport anyone it saw fit from the West Coast. This order targeted Japanese immigrants, Heisei, and native-born citizens of Japanese descent, Nisei, 120,000 of whom were deported to desert concentration camps for the rest of the war, unless released to manual labor or serve in the armed forces. It was validated by the Supreme Court's 1944 Komatsu decision, which has never been overturned. Moving past 1945, the McCarthyite Red Scare is remembered, but in ways that soften its impact and mask the responsibility of liberals and the larger civil society. Large-scale purges of employment and blacklists began well before Senator Joseph McCarthy became a household figure in 1950 and lasted long after the Senate censured him in 1954. In 1947, President Truman ordered a loyalty security program to assess the political sympathies of federal employees. The criteria for loyalty were entirely ideological. Thousands of government workers were fired and many more quit, a process repeated in every state and by all employers with government contracts. Constitutional protections of due process were abrogated. The FBI interviewed neighbors and associates and presented evidence in camera as to what books people read or opinions they had voiced. The Supreme Court has never struck down the concept that political tests can be used as a standard for employment. If the President were to instruct the current Attorney General to establish a similar loyalty program, why do we assume it would not pass muster with this Congress and this Supreme Court? A worse precedent is the FBI's covert COINTELPRO counterintelligence program of 1956 to 1971, focused on disrupting supposed radical threats, including the use of infiltrators, sabotage, and disinformation. As is well known, the FBI tried to force Martin Luther King Jr. to commit suicide by circulating taped recordings of his extramarital sexual activities to the press and then to his wife. The internal violence that consumed the Black Panther Party in 1969 to 1971 was largely the work of FBI agents spreading rumors. Repression by local law enforcement was more direct. For instance, the Chicago Police Department executed Panther leaders Fred Hampton and Mark Clark while they slept. It is naive to think these precedents are not on the minds of the president and the people around him. Trump justified his attempted ban on Muslims entering the U.S. by invoking FDR's executive order authorizing internment. He has pardoned Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who used his shield to cover explicitly racial violence against Mexicans and Mexican Americans. Newt Gingrich, one of the president's closest advisors, has called for a new House Un-American Activities Committee, with predictable consequences. Most frightening, of course, is the presidential tolerance extended to neo-Nazi, alt-right groups, equating them with civil rights protesters. In sum, it has repeatedly happened here, and it may again, with lasting consequences. Van Gogh teaches history at Franklin.